Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. I am so incredibly excited to be your host and, as always, your dedicated CMA exam coach for today's session. If you are a focused learner trying to finally master the ins and outs of indirect costs, you are in exactly the right place. In our last few sessions, we talked all about how overhead behaves, looking at fixed versus variable costs. But today we're flipping the script. We're looking at overhead from a completely different, highly testable angle. Where exactly does it come from? And ultimately, who is actually responsible for it? All right, let's dive right in and unlock your ultimate CMA exam guide for overhead allocation and accountability. So picture this for a second. Have you ever looked at an internal corporate income statement and just wondered why a hardworking, super efficient manufacturing department is suddenly getting penalized for the CEO's massive salary? Or maybe their margins are absolutely tanking because of some massive expense from the corporate legal team. It feels inherently unfair, right? Well, solving that exact dilemma of fairness and accountability is exactly what we're going to tackle today. Here's our quick roadmap for today. First up, the overhead dilemma. Then we'll dive into departmental overhead and local control. Third, we zoom out to corporate overhead. Fourth, we put them head-to-head in the ultimate overhead showdown. And finally, exam tips and next steps. So let's kick things off with Section 1, the overhead dilemma. The CMA exam is going to heavily test you on 3 specific actions. You absolutely have to know how organizations trace, accumulate, and allocate indirect costs. Why? Because the entire goal of management accounting is to ensure both accountability and accuracy. If you can't trace or allocate a cost properly, you literally can't accurately price your product, and you definitely can't evaluate your managers fairly. To master those 3 actions, we've got to understand the fundamental difference between our 2 main types of overhead. Which brings us right to Section 2, departmental overhead and local control. We're going to start from the bottom up, standing right there on the factory floor. Here is the formal definition you need to lock in. Departmental overhead is made up of indirect costs that can be traced directly to a specific department, but not to a specific unit of product. The absolute keyword here is localized. These are costs incurred for the sole benefit of that one specific operational unit. They don't help out the folks across the street, and they certainly don't benefit the executives in another state. They belong right there in the department. Now, when you're walking around a manufacturing facility, you're going to encounter a couple different types of departments, and you need to know the difference. On one hand, we have producing departments. These are the teams actually touching the product. Think of your machining or assembly lines. On the other hand, we have service departments. These folks don't touch the product directly at all. They just exist to support the producing departments. Classic examples here are the maintenance crew or the factory cafeteria. Let's make this super concrete with some classic examples the CMA exam loves to use. Over in the machining department, we're talking about things like specific lubricants for the CNC machines or the machining supervisor's salary. If we stroll over to the assembly department, their overhead is stuff like small rivets, glue, or specialized little tools used only by the assembly crew. See how that works? It brilliantly illustrates that these costs, even though they're indirect to the final product, are completely direct and traceable to their specific departments. And this brings us to a massively important concept for your exam. Because these costs happen right inside the department manager usually has operational control over them. If that machining supervisor is wasting a ton of machine oil, that inefficiency shows up directly in their departmental overhead. This is exactly why we use departmental overhead rates, like machine hours for machining and direct labor hours for assembly, for precise product costing, rather than just leaning on one giant, totally inaccurate factory-wide rate. Local control demands local measurement. All right, now that we've totally mastered the factory floor, let's jump into Section 3, corporate overhead and the big picture. We're going to do a bit of a narrative pivot here. I want you to completely zoom way, way out from that localized factory floor and visualize the entire organization. Imagine a giant, high-rise corporate headquarters building with regional offices and factories spread out all across the country beneath it. So here's your definition for this top level. Corporate overhead, which you might sometimes see called central or institutional overhead, consist of the costs incurred to execute overall business operations. These are costs that simply cannot be traced back to any single department, factory, or product line. We're talking about the massive expenses that sustain the organization as one whole entity. Let's flush this out with some classic corporate examples. We're talking executive salaries, your CEO, your CFO, the chief legal officer. We're looking at rent and utilities for that massive HQ building. It also includes centralized HR, legal teams, giant nationwide marketing campaigns, and global IT infrastructure and cybersecurity. Just notice the direct contrast to our factory floor examples here. Literally nobody on the assembly line is using global cybersecurity software to glue a part together. The absolutely crucial point you have to master here is controllability. This is heavily tested. Just think about it logically. A factory floor manager in Ohio has absolutely zero control over how much the corporate headquarters in New York decides to drop on a multi-million-dollar national television commercial. It's completely outside of their jurisdiction.
And because they lack control, we arrive at the golden rule of performance evaluation. Under responsibility accounting, which is a major topic you're gonna want to master, departmental managers are not held accountable for corporate overhead. Putting on my coach's hat for a second, I really need to hammer this home. You cannot evaluate a manager's performance based on costs they cannot control. It totally destroys morale and it completely invalidates your performance metrics.
But we still have a problem, right? Those massive corporate expenses have to get paid for somehow. To figure out if a product line is truly profitable in the long run, companies will often attempt to force these corporate costs down to the departments by allocating them. They'll use allocation bases like square footage, total revenue, or headcount. The examiners absolutely love to test you on the fairness of this. Because if a company uses an arbitrary allocation base, it can dangerously distort a department's performance and cause executives to make some really terrible business decisions.
Let's bring all these concepts together in Section 4 for the ultimate overhead showdown.
I'd honestly take a screenshot of this matrix. It is the perfect study guide. For location, remember departmental is local, while corporate is central. For traceability, departmental connects right to the unit, but corporate is totally untraceable to any single department. The biggest one, control. Departmental is controllable by the local manager, but corporate is strictly non-controllable. And finally, your CMA focus, departmental overhead is used for precise product costing and variance analysis, whereas corporate overhead is evaluated for overall long-term profitability and broad responsibility accounting. Keep this mental image locked in for exam day.
And finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, exam tips and next steps.
Okay, here is my most actionable piece of advice for navigating those really tricky multiple-choice performance evaluation questions. When you're reading a scenario, look very, very carefully at who is actually being evaluated. If the question asks you to evaluate a departmental manager's operational performance, you must exclude corporate overhead allocations from your calculations. Why? Because those costs are non-controllable by that manager. Please do not let the exam trick you into adding them in. To quickly summarize the core themes we've explored today, departmental overhead is all about operational precision and local control. It's the nitty-gritty of making the product efficiently. Corporate overhead, on the flip side, is about organizational survival and top-level strategic cost management. Both are totally vital, but they serve completely different analytical purposes in management accounting. Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question. We know that service departments, like maintenance, support our producing departments. But how exactly do we fairly allocate those local service department costs over to production? Well, doing that requires mastering the direct, step-down, and reciprocal methods, which is exactly what we're going to conquer in our next explainer session. Until then, grab your calculator, hit that test bank to practice some responsibility accounting questions, and remember, your certification is a lot closer than you think. Keep grinding, and I'll see you next time.